And thank you, everyone, for coming to Demos today, and thank you to the panelists for joining us. Unfortunately, the decision that came down a little over 2 weeks ago was not a surprise to us. We had been preparing for the court to take up the issue of aggregate contribution limits and preparing for them to decide in this way. Also, fortunately, we knew that in a way this could be a galvanizing moment. And in some ways, in ways that I think that my colleagues will talk about more, this could actually be a liberating moment for the reform community to get out of a box that had left really a generation of reformers trying to argue to justify a democracy with a very, very narrow tool of the reason of quid pro quo corruption. And so, in a way, even though very many observers and people across the country were dispirited by the decision, I think that at Demos we felt like, okay, we know exactly what the work is that needs to be done. And I think we're in a very exciting moment because the conversation about campaign finance reform is not actually understood that way among the American people. And that's great. Because campaign finance reform is not a value that gets you out of bed in the morning. All of the issues that no offense to anyone here, exactly. Yeah. What does get millions of Americans out of bed in the morning and demand that they engage in the very messy process of making their voice heard and organizing with other Americans are urgent issues around our economy, are the climate crisis, are the sense of inefficacy that people have over the very basic decisions at the state, local, and certainly federal level. So as we think about the other major conversation that's happening in this country right now around economic inequality and the very deep feeling that most Americans have that the game is rigged, that the structures that allowed for the creation of the great American middle class have not only corroded, but in fact have been actively dismantled, and that the people who have the most power and say in our political life have very different interests and concerns than them and their neighbors. I'll take just one example, which is very much top of mind for millions of Americans and activists, which is the minimum wage, which we know peaked in its real value in 1968 and is now around a third less in real value and purchasing power than it was at that time. We know that 1 out of every 4 workers in this country is a low-wage worker. And we know actually what that means to daily life of trying to make ends meet, juggle raising children, getting to work, trying to even think about planning for the future. And we know that there is a highly supported public solution to that very common problem of low pay. We know that the majority of Republican voters actually support raising the minimum wage, and we know that the public in general, about 7 out of 10, not only support raising the minimum wage, but believe that the minimum wage should be high enough so that no full-time worker lives in poverty. That's what we know. That's why the president was able to say that in a State of the Union address, and we saw the CNN dials go off the charts. But we also know, increasingly because of the really pioneering political science research of people like Martin Gillens and Larry Page, Ben Page and Larry Bartels, much of which is cataloged in a foundational report for Demos called Stack Deck, which you should find in the lobby. We also know that that very idea that work should pay so that someone working full-time should not live in poverty is actually a proposition that gets minority support among the donor class. In this particular Ben Page study, it was essentially the 1%. But as we look at other ways of measuring this, even down to the 10% of Americans who really are of the economic class that gives the vast majority of donations in our current campaign finance system, across the economic spectrum, issues of taxation, deregulation, the relative importance of deficits versus investments, we see that the donor class has different economic priorities and opinions than the rest of us. And that is what has helped to bring in the inequality era. I will leave it at that because it actually is, I think, a galvanizing connection. that for the first time in a generation, the issue that is the most important existential issue for most Americans is linked to these questions that actually do get the people in this room up in the morning.
Thank you very much, Heather.